Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Let's have a look at the 10 best medieval weapons. Well, first of all, what do I mean by best? And secondly, what do I mean by medieval? So for the purposes of this video, medieval I will call 1000 AD to 1500 AD. Okay, that's the kind of high to late medieval period. In terms of best, what I'm qualifying these top 10 as are the weapons that I consider made the biggest impact on the medieval battlefield. That is, in other words, they were the most successful and had the most influence. So in at number 10 we have the humble dagger. This dagger was a specialised fighting weapon, obviously for close range, and it came in many different forms, and that's a bit of a cop-out, I have to admit. I could have broken this down into rondel daggers, bollock daggers, analaces, all sorts of other types of dagger, but generally speaking, because it's in at number 10, I thought it had to be in there. So let's just say the dagger. I differentiate it from a knife because a knife is generally speaking also utilitarian, used in other activities such as cookery or hunting, but the dagger is specifically a fighting weapon, usually predominantly a stabbing or thrusting weapon. In the 13th century we see knights regularly starting to wear daggers on the other sides to their swords, and these were the weapons which would be used in grappling range, in wrestling range, and are very important in getting past or getting around armour, which is quite a difficult task in itself, and often swords weren't up to the job when it came into grappling range. In at number 9 is the hand axe, the one-handed axe, and whilst these weren't incredibly important on the medieval battlefield, they were however used over a broad period of time. We see them in the so-called Viking era, or the late kind of Dark Ages as some people would call it, the early medieval period, and often they took the place of a sword where someone didn't necessarily have access to a sword or couldn't afford a sword. Obviously, generally speaking, axes were cheaper to make than swords. You can make a functional axe relatively easily, relatively cheaply, and so therefore they often stood in the place of as a sidearm, that is a weapon that you wore at your side and as a backup weapon to your primary or main weapon. So very often they weren't necessarily a main battlefield weapon, but nevertheless they were quite ubiquitous and they're found across a very broad area. And in the late medieval period we see adaptations of them that are specialised for armoured fighting, and were used sometimes by horsemen, sometimes by people on foot, and in fact they could have very expensive, very high status versions which were used for fighting in armour against other people in armour. In at number 8 is the two-handed axe or poleaxe. I've rolled these two in together because I see them as related weapons. At the beginning of our period, if we look at, for example, the Battle of Hastings, 1066, we see these housecarls using these big two-handed axes in the Bayeux tapestry, and they use them to bring down horses and to fight against opponents on foot as well. And these were quite iconic, important weapons of the time, the kind of shock and awe weapons, and they wouldn't have been used by themselves. They would have been used alongside people using swords and shields, spears and shields, and indeed archers as well. And so they were one particular weapon that were used by a particular type of soldier for a particular role. But nevertheless, large two-handed axes like this continued in use right the way through the 11th, 12th and 13th centuries, and by the 14th century we see them starting to take on a new form with additional spikes and hammers so that they'll be more useful for fighting against armoured opponents. As the armour increased, the weapons adapted and evolved to suit the armour, so that we see hammers and spikes and top spikes and bottom spikes added so that the armoured opponent has more tools in his toolbox to fight against the other armoured opponent. In at number 7 we have the halberd and the bill. I've rolled these two in together because they fulfil a very similar role and were used in a similar role. They're both what we would call pole arms or pole weapons. They're longer than the poleaxe, they're longer than the two-handed axe, and we could say that they were more influential on the medieval battlefield. Indeed, some armies were utterly specialised in their use. The English famously made great use of the bill, and halberds were very popular in Germany, Austria and Switzerland. Both weapons are able to chop and to thrust, so they have the thrusting ability of a spear, the chopping ability of an axe, and both of them have some degree of hooking ability as well, which is very useful not only against mounted opponents that are attempting to bring either their horses down by trapping their legs, hooking their legs, or indeed by pulling riders off horses, but also very useful in line against other opponents on foot, infantry, in order to hook shields, hook opposing weapons, hook people's limbs as well. So these weapons with their thrusting, chopping and hooking abilities are very, very versatile, and particularly from the late 14th century onwards, we see them having an increasingly important role on the battlefield, such that by the Renaissance, by the 16th century, we see halberds and bills being incredibly numerous and important on the battlefield. In at number 6 we have the first missile weapon, that is projectile weapon of this list, and it is the crossbow or arbalète. And this is quite simply a combination obviously of a bow and a stock. It was quite groundbreaking in its time because of course unlike a bow it can be loaded, held at full draw or cocked, and kept that way for some period of time. The first crossbows used wooden bows, sometimes with horn and sinew used in addition, and the later ones have usually steel bows. Both have their relative strengths and weaknesses, and the steel bows and the wooden bows can be made up to phenomenally powerful draw weights. The crossbow was a real game changer in European warfare. It was rated quite highly against armour, obviously against mail and gambeson armour in the earlier part of the period we're discussing. It was highly effective, and shields or pavises, large shields, came into use to protect the crossbowmen while they were loading. One of the disadvantages undoubtedly with the crossbow is that it is relatively slow to load and shoot compared to a handheld bow. This being said, a good crossbowman could still shoot a number of bolts, depending on the type of crossbow and the power of the bow and the method of loading, could shoot a number of bolts per minute. So they still had a rate of fire, if we call it fire, a rate of fire which is higher than a musket, for example. They had a similar range to longbows of the day, and a similar degree of penetrative ability when it came to hitting targets, whether they be people in clothes, light armour or indeed heavy armour. Certain nations, for example the Genoese and France in general, became quite famous for their crossbowmen and used them extensively in the wars of the 14th and 15th centuries. It's absolutely fair to say that the crossbow had a huge impact on European warfare. In at number 5 is the pike. So what is the pike? Well, the pike is essentially a very long version of the spear. I've separated it from the spear because it is a specialised weapon and is used in specialised ways. Generally speaking, in medieval Europe they were not used with shields because of their length. They were usually held with 2 hands because you needed 2 hands to wield a weapon of this length and hold it effectively. Pikes were first used notably in the 14th century. The Swiss made extensive use of them against the Austrians in their wars, but additionally the Scots used very long spears, we could say early short pikes, against the English as well in Edward I's wars in Scotland. The pike as a weapon was not a new innovation. Of course, the ancient world had used pikes, and in fact the Romans had themselves initially used pikes and eventually established a new style of warfare that overcame pike columns or pike blocks. But in the medieval period, the pike formation, the pike block, was reborn and was an extremely effective way of nullifying the effect of cavalry, and it was also a very good way of protecting your own missile troops, for example archers or gunners. It's fair to say that during the 15th century, pikes in certain parts of Europe became increasingly important, such that by the 16th century we start to see pike formations, pike blocks, becoming incredibly important in European warfare and being really critical to protecting gunners and artillery that were becoming an increasing factor in their own right after the year 1500. In at number 4 is the lance, the cavalry lance. Obviously functionally this is similar to the pike. It's a long wooden shaft with a point on the end, but really used by cavalry initially in the Norman period, so around the year 1000 to 1100. The couched lance, the specialised cavalry lance, really had a huge impact on European warfare, and what we see in the first few centuries after 1000 AD is heavy cavalry being an incredibly important factor on European warfare and sculpting every aspect of European history. The knight, the iconic knight, was defined by their use of the lance on horseback. In its initial form, the lance of course was simply a spear that was used on horseback, but more specialised forms of lance did develop, some which were designed to prevent over-penetration of the target, some which were designed to break in the target. And so the lance really became a very specialised cavalry weapon, and in fact continued to be used into the 20th century. Lances still being used in World War I and beyond in some cases. But in the medieval period, the cavalry lance, used most famously by European knights, was absolutely dictated the manner of medieval warfare, and the knight on horseback with his lance was probably, at least socially, the most important element of medieval armies. Huge infrastructures were created to feed and equip and arm the medieval knight so that they could deliver lances anywhere that their king required them to. Of course, the lance also gave rise to the sport of jousting, and specific jousting lances and jousting armour were developed for this sport, and huge amounts of resources were poured into it. In at number 3 we have the one-handed arming sword. So an arming sword simply means a sword that you wear, and quite simply the sword is primarily a backup weapon, a sidearm. That means something you can wear. Whilst it very often wasn't the primary weapon, often the primary weapon even of a knight would be a lance on horseback or a spear on foot. In some cases things like a poleaxe on foot in the later periods. But even, you know, for a typical infantryman, for example an archer, their primary weapon would be a bow, the secondary weapon would be a sword. But that's the point, the sword was everywhere. Every soldier in a late medieval army had a sword of some kind, or at least very, very usually so, and the sword was their backup weapon, was their sidearm, so it didn't matter whether you were an archer or a crossbowman or a knight or managing siege artillery, you had a sword as your sidearm, and for that reason swords were incredibly important and actually used quite a bit. Whilst they weren't primary weapons, they were the weapon that you would fall back on, that you would use in a pursuit or a retreat, or indeed storming, breaching the walls of a castle. They were the weapon that when archers were attacked by cavalry they might have to fall back on using. So swords were everywhere, and it was the one-handed sword that dominated. Two-handed swords were a more specialised innovation that came later on in the 13th century. But the one-handed sword, used predominantly with a shield, which had been around since the Bronze Age, and right the way through the Viking era, the so-called Dark Ages, and into the medieval period that we're looking at from 1000 AD onwards, the sword was the most important sidearm and was everywhere. In at number 2 we have the bow. How could we ignore the bow? I have placed the bow much more highly than the crossbow for a number of reasons. One, because it's around for a longer period, but also importantly because it covers a much wider area as well. We know that many of the nations that invaded what we now call Europe, for example the Mongols and the Ottoman Turks, made extensive use of the bow. Therefore the bow wasn't only incredibly useful throughout this period within Europe, but is incredibly important as well amongst the armies that were invading Europe. I grouped all handheld bows together because it seemed unwise to separate, for example, composite recurve bows from simple longbows. Both of these are functionally the same. They both have similar rates of fire, again if we use the word fire in this case, but they have similar rates of fire, shoot similar types of arrows and have similar effects on the target. European longbows have the advantage of being relatively easier to make while still being able to achieve very high draw weights and very high efficiency. Composite recurve bows on the other hand take longer to make, are relatively speaking more fragile, but probably are more efficient and can achieve longer range. But in terms of warfare, most shooting would have been done within 300 yards, and so functionally the European longbow and the outside of Europe composite recurve bow achieve similar goals in similar ways. I feel that the bow absolutely has to occupy this very high spot, number 2 in this list, because it really had a huge effect on all European warfare, not just in this period, but for centuries beforehand. The bow was only really supplanted by gunpowder, which of course inextricably changed warfare after the year 1500. But in our period, the bow was absolutely the supreme missile weapon. Admittedly, alongside crossbows, but generally speaking, and this is one of the other reasons why I put the bow much higher up than the crossbow, generally speaking, when crossbows came against longbows, the longbows usually won out because of their much higher rate of fire. And finally, in number 1 spot, we have the spear, the humble spear. One of the most simple weapons in a sense that's been around since prehistory, probably one of the earliest weapons that mankind ever crafted. And yet in the medieval period, with all of the other weapons available to them, the spear was still a supremely important weapon. And it's fair to point out, of course, that the spear is related to the lance and the pike, and perhaps even debatably the halberd and the bill as well, which also feature in this list. But the spear is really the granddaddy and also the king of weapons. Spears could be used to repel cavalry, they could be used by cavalry, they could be used two-handed or one-handed with a shield. They could be used in numerous different ways. They could be thrown or they could be retained as a hand weapon. They could be long or they could be short. They could have different styles of head. Some of them could cut as well as thrust. When we look at the Bayeux Tapestry, there's no shadow of a doubt that the most numerous weapon on there is the spear. When we look at later period medieval sources, spears are still common, admittedly mixed in with other types of more specialised pole weapon, but ultimately the spear is their originator. Therefore, the spear wins the number 1 spot on the best medieval weapon, and I think rightly so. And of course, we shouldn't forget that the spear was still being used around the world by different cultures in the 19th century and into the 20th century as well as a weapon of war. So there we have it. Those are my 10 best medieval weapons within the parameters I've set. I think honourable mentions have to go for various reasons also to the two-handed sword or longsword, warhammers, maces, flails, glaives and partisans. But I don't consider any of those weapons to have been individually influential enough on the medieval battlefield. These 10 that I've listed I consider the most important medieval weapons. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you for the next video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We have extra videos on Patreon and you can follow us on Facebook.